Hi everyone, as you are all starting to get your dinner from the conference center hallway, please slowly make your way over to the seats in the ballroom. Please note that... Okay.
Never mind.
It's fine.
Before we begin this evening session, we would like to take a moment to thank all who have been involved in the LABash 2024 planning process. Thank you to our 2024 LABash Planning Committee. Our faculty advisor, Patsy Owens. And our professional advisors, Daniel Martin, Chris Pritchard, and Matt Alside. Now, I know you weren't probably expecting this because Daniel's sitting way back over there, but please come onto stage to accept your thank you gifts from Mark and I for all your hard work.
And then a special thank you to Green Theory for sponsoring this evening's keynote and dinner. We would like to welcome Green Theory to share 3 words.
Sorry, really quick before Green Theory comes, we'd like to thank our LABash co-directors, Olive and Mikey, for all of the exceptional work they've been putting into this conference.
Right, I'll now leave it to Green Theory.
Thanks, Mark, and to all of the LABash team. It's been great kind of going, hearing about the planning with you guys since last year in Kansas. And just to see what a great job that you guys have done. Before Green Theory, I came from an event planning background, and I know how much work it is, so I can really appreciate all the time and effort, and I can't believe you still got your studies done at the same time. LABash, I have to say, is our favorite event that we do. We do a lot of shows. We meet with a lot of different organizations throughout the year. But coming to LABash, it's so great to catch the excitement of all of you guys here. And I know, you hear the news, you hear what's going on, and I really think that we're in a good place. With you guys, the great work that you're doing, things that you're implementing to protect our environment and our green spaces, and just creating, a better future for all of us. It's super exciting. We're thrilled, and we are excited. We're taking it to Canada next year. Not that close to Vancouver, but it's close to our head office in Tillsonburg, so that's kind of fun for us. So maybe some of you will get to tour that. But also, do you guys know that it's Matt's birthday today? So I think we need to sing a happy birthday. I'm not going to sing into the mic because my voice is horrible, but come on. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Matt. Happy birthday to you. Enjoy your final night, and we'll see you in Guelph, if not before.
We are grateful for Green Theory and all of our sponsors who have helped make LABash 2024 possible. Next, we're beyond excited to announce that as Green Theory mentioned, the University of Guelph will be the host for next year's LABash conference. Please welcome LABash 2025 conference directors, Feline Darling and Shariah Vajan.
Hello everyone, I'm Feline. And I'm Shariah. To begin, we would like to thank everyone here for making this such an amazing LABash conference. Thank you to the sponsors, speakers, conference organizers, and attendees. We are extremely excited to formally announce that LABash 2025 will be hosted by the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada. It has been 16 years since LABash has been back home where it all began in 1970.
Back in the 70s when LABash began, it was a way for students to come together and talk about what they're learning, how they're learning, and exchange notes about the curriculum. With our ever-changing world, this is still incredibly important, and we are so excited to bring you guys all up north, so hop on your moose, come take a shot of maple syrup, and let's bring LABash home. We cannot wait for the University of Guelph to bring LABash home next year in Ontario, Canada.
Now, please welcome Gena Wirth as our final keynote of the 2024 LABash conference. Gena Wirth is design principal and partner at SCAPE. She works with cities, community advocates, and landowners to reveal the immense ecological and cultural potential of public landscapes. As design principal, Gena translates research into practice, leading the design and implementation of complex, multi-stakeholder landscapes, including public and private waterfronts, regional trail systems, parks, plazas, and climate adaptation plans. Within SCAPE, Gena leads firm-wide design standards, ensuring excellence from concept through construction, and serves as principal in charge for a wide range of projects across the U.S., spanning typologies and scales. She also serves on SCAPE's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, helping advance the firm's commitments to social and racial justice within our work and throughout the field. She holds a Master's in Landscape Architecture and Master of Urban Planning, with distinction from the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University, and a Bachelor's in Horticulture from the University of Delaware. Please welcome Gena Wirth for her keynote, Adaptive Landscapes.
Great. Okay. Hello, everyone. It's such an honor to be here this evening. Special thanks to the LABash Planning Committee. The level of excellence involved in the planning around this conference was just wonderful, and I do think we need another round of applause for the group. I'm here tonight to kind of talk about what feels a little bit like a crazy mix of things in my head. It's a lecture that I've never given before, so forgive me if there's a little hard to follow or some moments where I seem a little rambly. When the LABash Planning Committee reached out, they asked me to speak both about my work as in professional practice at SCAPE Landscape Architecture, but also my work as a nonprofit kind of member and collaborator of the Dredge Research Collaborative, which is just in a way, kind of just a group of friends that like doing interesting things around sediments, a little bit nerdy. And so there are moments where these worlds have collided, but I've never had them collide in the format of a conference and a lecture. So I hope you all enjoy this collision this evening. So I'm gonna just start off by introducing these two worlds. They kind of live in different parts of my head. So it is kind of funny to have them all to come together tonight. I spend a lot of my time at SCAPE Landscape Architecture. We're a professional practice, right? This is like my job. This is like where I get my paycheck. I'm an owner in the company after many years. I've been there about 15, 16 years. SCAPE is 90 people. Our website is here. We practice primarily landscape architecture and landscape-driven urban design. And then the Dredge Research Collaborative is an organization that I joined, I think about 12 or 13 years ago. It was a small group when I joined, and now we're about 6 to 8 people, depending upon how you count. It's a nonprofit research group, and we've kind of grown to a point where we are working on projects that are compensated in some capacities in certain instances, but a lot of the work that you'll be seeing this evening is work that was done when it was more of like a volunteer organization, and our website is also here, so it has the .org note after its web address. So I'll be speaking at the kind of the work of these two groups and my involvement in it, but kind of bouncing back and forth. So it's like a little bit chronological, but a little alinear as well. And I called the lecture this evening Adaptive Landscapes, because both of these groups would work on highly coastal, highly dynamic landscapes, mostly waterfront landscapes, working at that interface between land and water. And they're kind of changing all the time. They're changing in response to climate change. They're changing just because these are dynamic landscapes that erode, that accrete, that kind of build up and change. And I also added this second edition of scaling design, because so many of these ideas embedded in these projects are scalar and are influencing and cross-pollinating other designs that we're doing in our practice and in our kind of like activist organizations. So there's a lot of cross-pollination between. And I also included these brown slides, which are just really basic takeaways for all of you, because I was so inspired to be talking to a number of students here, right? Like, can you raise your hand if you're a student? I think most of you are students because there's space issues, so it's really inspiring to be talking to so many students who are the future of the field of landscape architecture. So these little notes, like work with people that inspire you and align your work and passions. These have been important like life lessons for me in my last 16 years of practice, and I think hopefully are inspirational to all of you, and also probably obvious to all of you, right? You're all here because you're aligning your work and your passions, and you're here because you're collaborating with people that inspire you. So to get a little bit deeper into these two groups, I'll start with SCAPE. So SCAPE is a landscape architecture practice. It includes many, many, many people that inspired me. All of my colleagues. This is just a tiny snapshot of our website of the people that work at SCAPE and I collaborate with on a daily basis. And in many ways, it's like easy to stand up here tonight and like share this work and talk about how great it is, but it's really only possible because of this like collective collaboration. So an office is just the people that work there, right? Like when you think about like what is our value as a company, it's not like the computers, you know, it's not physical stuff, it is the collaboration and the ability to work with other talented people to make projects come to fruition. So my collaborators at SCAPE, especially my collaborative principal team, is so kind of important to the work that we do. SCAPE is located in 3 locations. We're based in New York City, so that's the location of our office there on the left. And we have most of our staff in New York. A couple of years ago, we started an amazing office in New Orleans, which has grown to be, I think now almost 20 full-time staff. So it's been a real interesting kind of geography jump and kind of whole new type of practice where that office mostly kind of influences projects around the Southeast. And just a year and a half ago or so, we started our San Francisco office, which has been a wonderful, wild adventure in the Bay Area. And I'm really excited to go there after this conference tomorrow, check in on San Francisco. But I think one thing that ties these projects, or these offices together, is these are all in cities that have a really strong relationship with water, right? If you look at the kind of the screen, there's almost more teal here than there is white, right? Like we're dealing with cities that are grappling with issues of urban ecologies along waterfronts and dealing with climate change and sea level rise and flood risk. So that very much influences our work. SCAPE is very interdisciplinary, especially within like the design fields. So Many people at SCAPE kind of bring like dual degrees or different perspectives like to the table. So horticulturists, urban designers, urban planners, landscape architects, lots of kind of cross-pollination between the fields. And we primarily work in the United States, so we're like concerned with issues in the United States, dealing with different municipalities, different private clients, different public clients, and this is a smattering of some of the work that we progress. And we are driven by passion and a desire to kind of change the world for the better and grapple with many of these big issues that we face that I'm sure came up in the conference today, issues of climate change, issues of biodiversity loss, and issues of social inequity. And we try and kind of channel this into our work in many different ways. We're working on dynamic landscapes that can adapt and can change over time. We're working in highly urban ecosystems, trying to think about what role cities might play in helping solve the biodiversity crisis. And we're trying very hard to engage communities, particularly in areas where communities have historically not been engaged or meaningful parts or partners in the design process. We work across many different scales, so again, more of like a shot of our website of how we apply our landscape thinking. Sometimes just like walking into the office and working on, jumping between different meetings with teams is really mind-boggling because you might be like picking out the color of a brick or talking about the joint detail and then talking about like how to represent the entire state of Louisiana for a coastal master plan. So a lot of like back and forth, so you have to be really comfortable with. And we work on a wide range of projects. So these are just a couple of projects we've advanced in the past couple of years. A really magnificent urban waterfront park along the Mississippi in Memphis. This kind of project is all about reconnecting people back to the river and creating a social space of joy and celebration along the waterfront, Tomley Park, named after a local hero. This is Town Ranch Commons in Lexington, Kentucky, a kind of 2-mile long, 22-foot wide public realm project to improve bicycle and pedestrian movement throughout the city, but also really inspired by like the geologic undercurrents of the city and the way water moves through Lexington. And this is a project, if anyone's going to San Francisco, because you're already here in California and it's so close, I invite you to come check out China Basin Park, which is part of the Mission Rock neighborhood right across from the Giant Stadium, a park that SCAPE is opening on Friday. So would love to see some of you there for that special day. So again, just kind of like a range of different like scales and types of landscape architecture that we're working on. So to shift gears a little bit, I'm going to do it a lot tonight, just kind of move between the worlds. I wanted to introduce the Dredge Research Collaborative a little bit more deeply. First, I want to call out Brett Milligan, who I think might be here tonight. Maybe could raise his hand. There he is in the back, yes. So as a collaborative, it's really important to call out your collaborators and embarrass them. So a lot of the work that you'll see from the DRC up here on the screen, Brett's been very involved in for many years. But there's many other collaborators part of this like wonderful nonprofit group. Sean Burkholder in Pennsylvania, Brian Davis in Charlottesville, Rob Holmes in Auburn, Justine Holtzman in Princeton, Brett who's here, and then myself. So you can see we're all spread across different geographies. I think we've actually never lived in the same city. And we all started collaborating together like way before Zoom and COVID and all of that. So it's always been kind of a nonprofit, like loose group of people who are just like each other, interested in the same kinds of ideas and concepts, and have kind of banded together to make the work more powerful through collaboration. So I think my message to all of you tonight is like, there are many ways to satisfy your professional desires through professional practice, but professional practice, I don't believe, can do it all. And so there are other ways and other avenues that you can kind of satisfy and explore your own personal research interests that might relate to landscape architecture. And so I think we've had a lot of like success in benefiting from the greater intelligence of collaboration. And so we are all here and interested and we're thinking about sediment, right? So that's, that's what the DRC focuses on. And so also we've had some great intern collaborators and some past and less active members are also shown here. But we are very interested in dredging and sediment. And so as landscape architects, we deal with soil, right, in the upland areas. That's like a core piece of our practice, a core material of landscape architecture. If you visit a park or a streetscape or a garden or a plaza and there is a zone where there's like planting or a planting bed or a soil bed, like a landscape architect like very likely has worked on that or shaped it or advised it or reviewed it in some way. Might even legally be required to like stamp a drawing for it to come to fruition, right? Make sure it's safe, etc. If you deal with any kind of sediment in the underwater landscape, it's really unlikely that a landscape architect has kind of reviewed that drawing or been part of the design process that shapes the creation of an underwater landscape. And so that is kind of how we all got together and got interested in not just how landscape architects, but how designers in general could play a bigger role in thinking about sediment and thinking about how these landscapes are made, how they're managed, how they could be adaptively managed, and how they could begin to advance like better ideas and concepts around dealing with climate change, dealing with local ecology, engaging local communities in their design and development. Traditionally, underwater landscapes, like for example, like a navigation canal, a shipping canal, or maybe like a marsh edge or a constructed eelgrass bed, those might be designed either by an ecologist or more likely an engineer. A lot of our coastal infrastructure, like bulkheads and navigation channels and riprap edges and slopes, are all designed by engineers and don't usually involve the kind of voice of a designer. And so we saw a lot of potential in that. There's a lot of things that are like pretty dysfunctional about how coastal engineering works, as I'm sure we're all like aware of in this room. Hardening these landscapes really loses a lot of habitat, doesn't connect with the greater like hydrogeological processes happening within the kind of larger scale watersheds and sediment sheds that these systems are part of. And often local communities and local ecologies like don't benefit from those highly engineered designs. So I think design here has a lot to offer, and we saw potential for that. This is one of like the diagrams. It's like an organizing diagram that we made as a group, talking about how the most like active moment where people engage with sediment is sometimes in the process of dredging. And so this happens in like large harbors where you might need to dredge to deepen a navigation channel so that your large container ship can get to the container port. Thinking about like some of those like cycles and systems as being very active moments where people are engaging with these materials. So that's how we kind of started with the dredge name, and it just kind of stuck, but we're really interested in like larger sediment patterns and sediment flows. And so we, a couple of us, Rob, Brett, and myself, recently came out with this book, Silt, Sand, Slurry, so I definitely recommend you take a look at it. It's a book about dredging, but it's also a book about larger sediment patterns and flows across the 4 coasts of the US, the Great Lakes, Louisiana, New York, and California. But it's also about the world that we are making, the way that our highly engineered processes have shaped these landscapes, some of the unintended consequences that we're beginning to wake up to, and kind of new precedents and patterns for thinking differently about how to design with sediment in a more intelligent and responsive way. And so, just like I kind of mentioned, we all have to be driven by our passions. I think like my personal kind of passion and reason I've been involved in the Dredge Research Collaborative is like not only is this kind of hidden world of like what happens below the water just really personally interesting to me, like understanding these systems of water and geology. I also just love visual representation and drawing, right? And wanted kind of an outlet to begin to explore other types of visual representation techniques. And I also love landscape storytelling, right? These landscapes hold these really powerful stories that are, again, all underwater and hidden. So this like little collaborative group kind of became a way to work with others to tell these important stories. And so I'll just share a couple, like a small like visual chapter from the book. This is about the New York Harbor. So it gives you a little bit of insight of like what we mean when we're talking about sediment flows and patterns. This is the larger, we think of watersheds, or maps out a watershed when you start a site analysis project. We call them sediment sheds, right? Thinking about the kind of area and flow of, if you think about a grain of sand or a grain of silt within a harbor channel, where does that come from? It's eroded off the hillside. So in the Greater Hudson River sediment shed, We have upstream sediment sources like storm runoff and spring snowmelt, bringing like small trickles of silt downstream. Those move to upstream Hudson River ports where they're dredged out. Like for example, the tidal range reaches pretty far north in the Hudson River, and boats go as far as Albany, and those channels within the Hudson River are also dredged and maintained. And then a lot of that material moves all the way down the Hudson and ends up in the New York Harbor, right at the mouth of the New York Harbor estuary, where also we have like massive container ports and large ships moving, and so also is kind of dredged out and moved around. There's a whole choreography that happens around it. And so these sections kind of begin to illustrate like how sediment moves through the system. This lower section is really showing where a lot of that sediment goes. A lot of it is taken offshore and kind of placed in like a deeper water zone. So historically that sediment would have collected along the like softer, slower edges that would have accreted and built out like marshes and mudflats. But we have containerized systems, we have hardened walls and bulkheads, and we have deeper straight walls, and so that sediment kind of gets like clogged up in the system and is removed and just exported offshore. Or that's what a majority of it goes. We've also begun to kind of look at these different geographies and start mapping and tracing like what does dredging mean from a time-based perspective. So there's like large dredging events like a harbor deepening project where ship channels get 5 or 6 feet deeper than they were previously. But there's also maintenance dredging, right? That just has to happen every year or every 5 years or every 10 years, like on a more repeat cycle. And then there's this question of like, well, where does this material go and what happens to it, right? Like if it's not being moved by more like natural processes of water movement or erosion, where are we taking it? And so this is a mapping of a moment in time in the New York Harbor where sediment, a lot of it is going to that large historic area remediation site. It's shown here in the bottom as the abbreviation HARS. So it's kind of moving from these channels and being brought offshore. But some of it is being used in other locations. Sometimes it's used for upland uses, like to cap a landfill or to be a road base. And sometimes it's used in restoration projects, and potentially there's a lot more options for this to happen. And so one project I'll feature is in Jamaica Bay. Let's see if I can highlight it. This is Jamaica Bay here in New York City, and this is the site of one very modest scale restoration project where many different stakeholder partners in New York City and New York State came together to think differently about sediment. The site is called Yellow Bar Island. So these images are a little bit older. This is a moment before drones, if you can all like imagine that in your minds. We weren't always able just to like go out and like press a couple buttons and send a drone out to get an amazing live aerial of your site. This is a couple of the Dredge Research collaborative interns and myself launching a kite into the sky with a camera attached to it to get some like DIY aerial photography. So very cool moment. But we're out on this island called Yellow Bar Island in the middle of Jamaica Bay in the harbor. And this is one of those like DIY mappings that we stitched together and made ourselves to look at this like really interesting, almost like a moonscape of a landscape where the Army Corps and other local partners like the local DEP in New York City Department of Environmental Protection kind of came together to fund the transport of sediment to these degraded marsh islands. These are marsh islands that are subsiding and sinking, sea level rise is kind of taking over, and marsh habitat is transforming to subtidal habitat and lower water habitat. And so a lot of that dredge material from New York Harbor, from the Harbor Deepening Project, which was clean dredge material, it's like clean sand, was brought here and very carefully placed, kind of like micro-graded. You can see some of the artificially created tidal channels kind of carved into this landscape. There's just a couple feet of grade change create radically different ecosystems across this site. And there's some really interesting planting techniques also happening here that we were trying to capture and understand over time. So there's plug planting at the interior with like a grid of goose fence to keep the geese from landing and eating all the plugs. But there's also moments, this like little kind of green like hair plug looking thing are these hammocks of small clusters of marsh as well as mussels all bound together, growing together, that were salvaged from the existing marsh and replanted around the perimeter. So some interesting kind of like novel dredge ecosystems emerging here, where this dredge material, instead of being taken offshore, is actually being used to kind of create a more robust urban ecosystem in Jamaica Bay. And it takes just a huge amount of coordination and partners to do this. This is not like easy work to just like point in 2 places on the map and connect the dots. You have to actually get the sediment here. You have to make sure the site is ready to receive it when it's able to be brought through. It's a shallower water landscape, so you have to think about how to move the sediment like through a pipeline or some other kind of shallow water transport system to get it. So any project like this, just by design, needs this kind of interdisciplinary collaborative approach. So it's why we highlighted it in our New York study. So that's just a kind of high-level snapshot of some of the fun things that the Dredge Research Collaborative is interested in. And we started studying these kinds of landscapes because we realized that like landscape architects and designers, like, we're not really being brought to the table as part of these conversations, and we felt like we had things to add. And so here's another reminder slide. You just pursue your ideas and design your own projects, right? Like when the RFP doesn't come or your office can't pursue like the kind of thing you want to be doing, you know, there are other avenues to kind of explore your own research interest. And so for us, this nonprofit group of interested people kind of became a method to do that. So I'm going to transition back to SCAPE, and I'm going to speed up a little bit. But I wanted to kind of frame some of this, like thinking about like pursuing alternative projects also through the lens of a professional practice. And so, you know, SCAPE is an amazing place, an amazing firm to work at. Not all of our projects are like really cool oyster projects. We have a very wide range of projects, but I'll talk about some of the fun oyster stuff tonight. But we have advanced a lot of the projects that help shape our identity through design competitions, which do allow you a bit more agency over the work and over the kind of the brief, right? So in many different projects, especially like RFPs or traditional client-based practice, you are always beholden to the client, right? And that's a very responsible way of practicing, and that's how pretty much all of our work happens. But competitions are this moment where you're kind of able to put out different ideas, and they will transform into client-based projects if you're lucky, which we were on some of our efforts. But they are these really great places to kind of just expand your mind and explore different scales of ideas. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about one of our projects called Living Breakwaters, but just added a slide in here to remind everyone that Living Breakwaters came out of a number of different, like small, speculative, almost like pop-up projects that we did in the office. One of which was a museum exhibition called Horticulture, which is about building a large-scale oyster reef to protect New York City's shoreline. The other one was this like fuzzy rope installation we did for a industrial client in Brooklyn, kind of testing new materials for like marine ecosystem and urban ecology, kind of habitat generation. So Living Breakwaters is a project that probably some of you know, right? Maybe anyone could like raise your hand if you've heard of this project or know about this project. Yeah, so I see like a fair number of hands up. I'm going to talk about it a little bit this evening, but this is a project we've literally been working on for a decade in our office, so there's like an enormous amount of documentation on it, so definitely like go to our website, find greater resources, there's like whole lectures on it. But it's been a powerful project for our office because it took that idea that we seeded in that earlier exhibition of thinking about like an oyster reef that could help reduce wave action and wave energy and protect the shores of New York City, and brought it to like a different site and an implementable scale and developed a team of people around it. We advanced this project through the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the Rebuild by Design competition many years ago, and it did win that competition and get funding, and it became like a more traditional client-based project, but started as like a more speculative research effort at SCAPE. The whole premise behind this project was thinking about resilience not just through the lens of like physical property protection or physical risk reduction. It was trying to think about coastal resilience in a way that was also about people, about social resilience, and about ecological resilience, how to kind of bundle and tie all those things together in a single project. It started through an investigation of shallow water landscapes. That's a uniting theme for this evening, shallow water landscapes. So we looked at different shallow water ecosystems and thought about different habitat-based structures that could help protect those adjacent shorelines. And this site in Staten Island, this is Staten Island here, this is called the New York Bight. It's like this large geologic kind of condition where like high intensity storms like Hurricane Sandy are kind of funneled right into the harbor mouth. And Staten Island is right here at that moment that receives a lot of that force when there are like high intensity storms and hurricanes. So it receives a lot of wave action and wave energy. We looked at these different landscapes, like the shallows, like salt marshes and shrublands and maritime forests and mudflats and salt pans and reefs, and thought about how they could, rather than helping protect a community or reducing physical risk in a community with like a wall or a riprap edge or something that would really sever people from the water, we thought more about this like layered approach of how to like layer up these different ecosystem types, like an offshore breakwater and a wetland restoration and a beach or dune restoration into like a layered, ecologically rich system that would also still inspire people to engage with the water, have this culture of resiliency, like bringing people back and down into the water. A lot of people live in this part of Staten Island because they love the relationship to the beach. So we didn't want a measure that would help protect against large storms to kind of cut people off from the water. And so this is the project, that kind of rendering of it at the competition stage, I think in 2012 or so, that came out of this process. So what we proposed was like a large scale breakwater and reef system that would help reduce storm impact to the edges of Staten Island. This is a community called Tottenville on the south shore of Staten Island. It's kind of a beachy ecosystem, but also would be designed to foster shallow water calm habitat that was more suitable for like people actually engaging the water, kayaking, sport fishing, etc. And also foster ecosystem resilience, thinking about how to regenerate some of this underwater life, which has been lost from this portion of New York Harbor, actually in some cases due to dredging. So there's a lot of cross connections in these projects. And so we designed this whole project to think about creating subtidal habitat for finfish, particularly juvenile finfish, as well as shellfish like lobsters and also oysters. So oysters are very much embedded in this design process. And I think here one of the takeaways is like none of this like large scale complex work is possible without truly engaging other disciplines and participating in your community. So that's been a very important theme with SCAPE's work over many years. So engaging other disciplines meant working with a whole host of different types of engineering firms on this effort, but also reaching out to marine biologists and asking them, like, what species should we be designing for? What species might live here? What species used to live here? And also getting more into the details of like, not just what species, but like what stage in that species' life might it actually be using this specific environment? And how do we be adaptive to things changing in the future? And so one of the kind of core habitat types we're trying to provide is space for juvenile fish, juvenile finfish. Like basically teenage fish hang out in Raritan Bay because they're born up the Hudson. It's where the spawning grounds of larger fish like the tautog is an example of like one of these juvenile fish that spawns up in the harbor. The little baby fish spend about a year in the river system where it's less saline. And then as juveniles or teenagers, they move into Raritan Bay, which is this environment here. And so through our collaborations with marine biologists, we started thinking about how do we create a better like resting and hiding space for juvenile fish before they become ocean-going adults that kind of move across the wider eastern seaboard. And so we found out that, historically, little juvenile fish have spent time hiding in oyster reefs, right? These like really complex structures that have lots of nooks and crannies. If you're a juvenile fish, you really want to find a tiny little hole that's like the size of your body, because no one can eat you if you're in a hole that's the size of your body. It's that basic. But through dredging, through increased sedimentation of the harbor, through water quality change in the turn of the century, New York lost almost all of its oyster reefs. So that like super complex habitat is essentially gone, right? And not kind of being replaced. It's being replaced with like a sandy bottom, like flat habitat. habitat. So a lot of those little juvenile fish hidey holes have disappeared. And so the project has really focused on trying to both artificially create some of those smaller pore spaces in the breakwaters, but also regenerate oyster reefs to this environment because water quality conditions over the past 30 or 40 years have dramatically improved in New York Harbor and potentially can host oysters again. And so this collaboration with marine biologists really changed a lot of our thinking around like how you design. You know, when we started working on this project in the competition phase, like I was very guilty of this too, we were drawing these like really awesome, wiggly, wild shapes for breakwaters. And then our marine biologist was like, well, that looks really cool, but you have to think of the scale of the fish. You have to really like focus and scale down and think about the like localized micro scale complexity that these juvenile fish really need. So we changed our design to focus on these concepts of these little protrusions kind of poking out from the breakwaters. They're called reef fingers and reef streets. Reef street is like the void between. And then we oriented these reef streets so they focus on the waveward side. So those little pores will always be kind of flushed clean by the waves. They won't fill up with sediment. And we also started working with other collaborators thinking about like new materials, like more ecological concrete that can provide more of a kind of host habitat for underwater organisms, and physically forming these structures so that they have both a micro and a macro level of complexity applied upon them. The image on the right here is kind of showing some of that work, the kind of inspirational work. But also we reached out to the community, right? And we were doing a lot of outreach in terms of public meetings and those kinds of efforts, but we wanted to kind of specifically engage the younger community, like the youth within this project. They're trying to connect with schools on the waterfront. We had a great partner in the Billion Oyster Project, thinking about they're called the Harbor School and the Billion Oyster Project. They're an amazing school in New York City, which focuses all of their curriculum on the waterfront, and they are trying to restore 1 billion oysters to New York City's waterfront. And so we partnered with them to do different educational outreach kind of activities within Staten Island schools to engage all the schools within like a quarter-mile like walking radius of the water into this project. So it was like a big effort, and part of that work was translated into an oyster gardening manual, as well as a middle school curriculum, which is now used by many of those middle schools. It's like an open source curriculum that came out of this like community effort. And so middle school students now are going out to the waterfront, monitoring like oyster cages and oyster baskets to better understand like their waterfront, these changing adaptive conditions, and gather data which can be helpful for implementing living breakwaters in the future. So I'm going to pause on that project, but I will return to it because that project has been going on for 10 years, so I'll give you a little update later. I'm going to go back to the Dredge Research Collaborative work. So I mentioned, like I showed a little profile of what we've been looking at in New York City. We kind of started looking all over the country at these different locations. The Great Lakes, so you can see the, this is a pretty big watershed around the Hudson River, but it doesn't compare in scale at all to the scales of watersheds like the Great Lakes or the Mississippi River ending in coastal Louisiana and the Gulf Coast. Or even where we sit today here in the West Coast, the Bay Delta, and Sacramento and San Joaquin river system. So we looked at these 4 different landscapes just to kind of understand their differences, right? This was really more of a research project, but it was also a project based in collaboration. So again, reaching out and kind of talking to different types of disciplines around dealing with dredge material, dealing with sediment. We felt like the design voice, just like the conference organizers tonight and throughout the week, had hosted this really amazing kind of meeting of the minds within the students of landscape architecture. We hosted much smaller, maybe nerdier events that we call Dredge Fest events. So we had a Dredge Fest New York, we had a Dredge Fest California, a Dredge Fest Great Lakes, and a Dredge Fest Gulf Coast in Louisiana that was held in Baton Rouge and New Orleans. That were really about trying to connect people in these industries that didn't really talk, right? A lot of dredge and sediment design is extremely contested, right? There's like a regulatory framework for which you can and can't dredge, and a lot of mitigation has to happen with it, so it can be kind of like a tense, combative environment between the people that want to dredge and the people that want to protect the ecosystems. And so we felt like design could be this really interesting voice to help like create a safer space for collaboration, for talking creatively about what could be done that could be both positive for navigation person, but also a juvenile finfish lover. So trying to bring these different groups together and using more speculative case studies and speculative design workshops, kind of begin to come up with other concepts and solutions for how to design and manage sediment. We also did really great site tours and field studies, kind of bringing these different people to actual dredge landscapes, standing on top of a place where they do dredge material sorting, right? Dividing clean and contaminated material or sorting material from sand and silt and clay to be repurposed or reused elsewhere. Really looking at these landscapes and studying them through visual representation and drawing was a big piece of our work, as well as modeling and testing. And then also you just have to do the research and put in the time, right? So this is the book Silt, Sand, Slurry that the three of us collaborated on really represents a decade of kind of looking at these systems. We're here in California, so I thought I would just put out some of the California stories quickly. It's a really interesting sediment shed that we're standing within today, within the Delta, kind of fed by the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers. This is a sediment shed that has dramatically changed over time and how sediment has moved through it. So one of the most kind of important and dramatic forces shaping this landscape was hydraulic mining in the late 1800s, with the gold rush. Some of the hillsides were almost literally being power washed to extract gold, and that generated just a huge pulse of sediment. Brett has written extensively on this topic, so he's really the expert there. But generated a huge pulse of sediment that moved downstream. It actually built and expanded marshes in the Bay Area and clogged a lot of waterways, led to more dredging in the Delta, building of levees with that dredge material, hardening of the edges. So it had this kind of ricochet effect across this wider, almost state scale sediment shed and watershed. Later, we've kind of tipped to a totally different direction where instead of a sediment surplus, there's almost a sediment scarcity in the Bay Area, not enough sediment is getting through because of these hardened channels, but mostly because of these large scale dams that exist for flood protection, for water provision, for erosion control upstream, right? And so just the sediment shed has completely transformed and changed. We're now, after 50, 80 years of living with the dam system, sediment has been clogged in dams behind and cannot get through and is not making its way down to the Bay Area, not contributing to mudflats, not contributing to marshes. So with climate change, you can only imagine what a challenge this potentially is. And so through some of our work within Dredge Fest California, this issue, we did more drawings on it, we tried to really describe it more carefully, we tried to understand it better ourselves, and we tried to think about we kind of need some of these dams because California needs water, right? Some dams are being removed, but not at the scale that's really going to probably change the math for the greater San Francisco Bay and the ecosystems that rely upon sediment. So is there a way that we could work more locally at the Bay scale? So this is a zoom in of the San Francisco Bay and all of the local tributaries that feed it. And so each of these local tributaries that feed the Bay, both with water and with sediment, also have their own individual stories of being highly modified big people, having smaller scale dams built within them, having more channels being hardened, more edges being kind of cut off. And so we thought, okay, maybe there's a way that some of these smaller tributaries could be redesigned to enable sediment flows and encourage that living infrastructure to develop. And so this was a really nice moment with SCAPE and the Dredge Research Collaborative, where we decided to kind of come together and actually collaborate with one another. So this was me collaborating with myself, but also with a lot of other great team members. So we pursued another design competition. SCAPE pursued a design competition called Resilient by Design that was held in the Bay Area. It was kind of a follow-up from the New York design competition that had occurred. And we put together a really interdisciplinary team with great engineers and local landscape architects. Also want to shout out to many members from the UC Davis team who are maybe here, over here I saw earlier today, like Claire. Part of this project led our community outreach. but also the Dredge Research Collaborative as a true teammate and partner on this work. And we really tried to embrace this kind of thinking that the baylands, the mucky, marshy, and muddy edges of the San Francisco Bay are living infrastructure. That's critical infrastructure that we need to invest in, that we need to protect, and we need to think about how to make more resilient over time. And so, as the DRC research really showed, there's a sediment scarcity issue in the Bay Area, and tidal baylands, like the marshes and mudflats that line the bay, they cushion urban edges and mitigate the risks of sea level rise. So if these systems cannot keep pace with climate change, marshes and mudflats need sediment inputs to literally be able to physically keep pace or even attempt to keep pace with climate change. If these ecosystems don't have that sediment supply, over time they will transition, going from a high marsh to a low marsh, or a low marsh to a mudflat, or a mudflat to an underwater habitat, and eventually become deeper water over time. So that's not only quite transformational for the species that live there, it's also, I think, quite impactful for the low-lying kind of community shown in pink here along the waterfront edges. So just to kind of look at that again, it's, this is a long-term, slow change that's happening in the Bay Area, but it's being triggered by that larger scale of dams and channels upstream. And so our team decided to focus on Alameda Creek, one of these local tributaries feeding the bay. It's one of the largest tributaries feeding the bay, and we thought about a whole design proposal around how can we both design with mud, and make this interesting, but also make sediment public, really engage the broader community in the conversation around sediment design. And we developed a whole proposal that we called Unlocked Alameda Creek, which was about different ways of modifying and kind of undoing some of the hard engineering and Army Corps work along the creek to unlock sediment flows up and down the watershed and bring more sediment to the bay so it could re-nourish the marshes and mudflats that line the bay slowly over time. It was really a proposal that thought about sediment, people, and fish kind of occupying and using the same landscape and prioritizing all three of those user groups. Usually we just prioritize people. That's the kind of environment and social and regulatory systems that we have set up. But in this project, it was really about working across that lower transect of Alameda Creek and thinking about ways of redesigning the channel itself to bring more sediment downstream and redesigning the bay edge to actually allow it into the coastal baylands where it can help nourish those systems. So this is a little screenshot. There's also more work online about this project or videos online about unlocking Alameda Creek, how the bed of Alameda Creek it still needed to remain hardened because many houses and many homes are built along levees here. You can't just erase those homes or blow up those levees. That's not really possible. But how could the levees remain, but the bottom of the creek be redesigned, have new types of vegetation, change the regulatory system so that different types of vegetation can be maintained and grown within that system to help sculpt different channels for sediment movement and for flooding and for fish migration. But also to allow people into this channel landscape and create a whole new kind of social space within the water. And we're doing that up in the creek, but also connecting the creek to the baylands, breaching the levee at really strategic locations so that sediment and water can move from the creek out into the bay, and also create these really important spaces for migratory fish that are moving from saltwater to freshwater systems and from freshwater systems to saltwater systems as they go through their life cycles. So this project, I think, just was really important for us to kind of work together to think about how designers could design with sediment, what it might look like, what kind of projects it might inspire and propose. We worked with the Alameda County Flood Control District really extensively on this, and this ultimately was an unfunded competition, but it's influencing a lot of the work that's happening in this region today. So some of the concepts about breaching the creek are embedded in the environmental impact study that's happening for this larger bayland element. Some of the elements are being advanced by the Alameda County Flood Control District in a little bit more engineering-like way. And then one of the big proposals for the edge of the baylands, this kind of concept of a more dynamic like pebble dune or cobble edge, the cobble beach condition is being piloted as part of one of the marsh restoration efforts here. So it's been just really interesting to see how this more idea-driven project is influencing some of the work in the Bay Area. But I also just want to like put up like, sadly we don't win all the competitions that we pursue, you know, like maybe that's the hope, that's what we all strive for. But it's really important to like put the ideas out there and like not be afraid to fail. It's good to like check your ego a little bit. It's good to kind of enrich your mind. And it's also just good to like stand by the ideas and concepts that you feel like are really important. So I'm gonna show you another SCAPE and Dredge Research collaborative project we worked on together for the city of Oceanside in California. This is another design competition. It was called ReBeach. We worked with a great engineering firm called ESA on this effort. They're very present in California, and I would highly recommend them as collaborators. Because they also take like a more nature-based approach to design. And so this is a city that has a big, wide, coastal, sandy beach. It's in Southern California, and the beach identity is really core to the shoreline. It's core to the identity of the place. It's always had a wide sandy beach in like the recent collective imagination, and it's also a big like surfer destination. So the beach is really important to that. But that beach is like very dramatically eroding. Like that's happening across Southern California. So it's not like it's not a special condition. It's a very unique community, but the condition of coastal erosion, I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And human impact has both grown and shrunk Oceanside's beach. So we did a little bit of that like sediment shed scale research, like zooming out, looking big picture, and began to understand that a lot of that big beach system that people know and love and have lodged in their mind as like the ecosystem type was actually created when the harbor was dredged. A lot of clean sand came out from that harbor dredging, you know, over 50 years ago and was placed on the beach and helped widen the beach. And over time, that sand has eroded away because natural systems like are dynamic and change. And then also, this system is like many systems in the coastal California area. The upland tributaries are dammed and hardened, and less sediment is moving through the system down to the beach edge. So there's not that like natural replenishment that's happening from the upland areas, and large infrastructure like this harbor breakwater is preventing sand and littoral drift from like moving up and down the shore and renourishing the beach. And so the beach is eroding. There's an intersection of public assets and a narrowing beach. Like our mission on this project was to identify a piece of the shore where we could implement like a pilot project to look at different ways of, rather than doing traditional beach nourishment, of just like going offshore, scooping out a bunch of sand and bringing it onto the shore. That historically hasn't been very successful for them. It's very funding intensive, it's very carbon intensive. So they were looking for alternative strategies and ways to kind of sustain the beach with erosion. And so we put forward this concept of a hybrid beach and dune park. This is the site that we chose. It's, you know, these little orange tags here show the narrowing beach over time, a beach that goes from 30 feet in width down to 5 feet in width. This is like a transition moment where the beach is nourished on the left or supplemented with sand from offshore. And then on the right, that hasn't really happened recently, and the kind of cobble core is emerging. So highly erosive condition. It was also a site where there was a little park. It's called Tyson Street Park, like shown along the edge here. And you can look at it, had maybe a very like Olmstedian aesthetic of like curving pathways and pastoral with lawns, which is not really like an appropriate landscape type for our like dynamic coastal shorelines and beach ecosystems. And so the proposal that we put forward collectively here was attempting to be both a pilot proposal. We really wanted to like test this concept and idea, and as nature-based as possible. So trying to, there would still be some like limited beach nourishment that would be required with this design, but way less than what they had been doing previously. And so the concept here was to think, a little bit differently about what more natural beach systems in this part of Southern California look like. Like, some are wide and sandy, but a lot of them are mixed grain beaches with both sand and cobble kind of making up that matrix of the underwater and shoreline environment. And they have cobble today along the shore. It appears when the sand erodes away, that kind of cobble core emerges. So we wanted to like build upon that cobble core, and we added these like large cobble crests to the beach, as well as these smaller nearshore reefs that were designed to kind of be dynamic over time, and also topped with like a perched sandy beach that could be maintained and widened to add more of that recreational space, to add more of that like beachfront environment, and to really make sure that kind of culture of the oceanside beach was still very present in this design. We also proposed what now I will freely just call a we lost this competition, so I don't have to be worried about people getting angry. But just a kind of minor like scale retreat, right? There's a large roadway and like public access path that runs along the shore. It's called the Strand, and we proposed like trying to pilot out like letting the Strand retreat, pulling the Strand in, changing it from its historic alignment, which is extremely vulnerable to coastal wave action and erosion, pulling it into the site and designing like a larger scale dune and beach system that could have native plants, that could have pedestrian boardwalks, trying to keep a lot of that program of the previous park and redesign it for a coastal context. Think about it as like a sandy beach, dog park, and playground, as well as walking paths, as opposed to those open lawn environments. So really thinking about a more contextual landscape type. And so this was our proposal, the hybrid beach and dune park that would have this mixed grain beach with these cobble crests, a large wide perched beach, and a shifted roadway, like really dramatically kind of changing the fabric of the Strand and the visual effect of the Strand by pulling it away from the shoreline. A lot of this work was inspired, you can see this in many of our projects, this work was inspired by some of the morphological conditions of the shore, both today and way back in time. These are historic cobble crest formations that form along the shore, so we were trying to like scale these up and use these as a semi-permanent way of stabilizing the beach. And so this was like the before image of the narrow sandy beach today and the wider expansive perch beach with the cobble crests and fingers that could emerge from it over time. And then the same with the dune park. The dune park was inspired by some of the historic dune systems that used to exist there, and the kind of concept of transforming what's a very static landscape in a very dynamic environment into a much more dynamic and adaptive landscape that like could shift if there was a major storm and kind of reshuffled and reshaped the way that the sand dunes were formed. And so, this is a like overall image that kind of showed this work. I think we still are very excited about this project. Ultimately, the client team in this competition chose an engineering firm that proposed what I would call just like a more conventional, like tried and true method that required a lot more sand input. They were not interested in kind of a more experimental, like more nature-based approach here. And so we didn't win, but like it still helped us advance a lot of really interesting thoughts, and I think we're going to be bringing these concepts to many of our other projects. So I would just say again, don't be afraid to fail. And also be really persistent, right? This kind of work and the scale of work working in the realm of coastal engineering and shoreline design, especially in urban areas, can take a really long time. It involves sometimes hundreds of stakeholders bringing people together. The landscape architect's role in this work is often like being that mediator and helping choreograph the conversation, helping a marine biologist talk to a civil engineer or a structural engineer, helping a community member like understand literally what's being proposed, because this work is complex, it's multi-scalar, it spans many geographies. And so we have to both be designers but also interpreters in our work. So this is I'm gonna go back to SCAPE's Living Breakwaters project, which I started with in Staten Island, back in New York, so leaving California. This is the timeline for this project, design and construction. So I don't even know if we would have proposed this project if we knew it was gonna take so long. And how much work it would, like collective work and energy it would take, right? So we finished the design competition in 2013, and then since then, our office has we've continued to be prime on this project, which is also kind of amazing, and slowly pushed this project into construction today. And you can even see here, we're no longer at this we are here moment, we're further along, but the construction period is also multiple years. So this project is under construction now and will be under construction, I think, for another 9 months or a year. Embedded with that has just been a huge engagement effort with the community, really continuing to work with these local schools and our partners at the Billion Oyster Project, which has been so important to advancing this work and making sure this project has stayed alive, because it's an engineering project, but it has a really strong social and ecological component, which has generated a lot of support. But it's also just had this huge technical underpinning. So SCAPE, we're not coastal modeling experts or anything like that, but we have worked with many different coastal engineers to analyze the existing site conditions, understand the potential for erosion, and then refine the breakwater design in relation to a dynamic shoreline, and trying to create a balance between a breakwater system which will help grow the shoreline slowly over time, not cause devastating erosion in other areas, and also not cause so much accretion and sedimentation that it impacts the local ecosystems. And so this is just a diagram that we use in our public outreach meetings, showing how by placing a breakwater closer to the shore or further away from the shore, there's this very dynamic response with how beaches grow and shrink. So it's a very rudimentary diagram if you're a coastal engineer, but it's not a concept that's a member of the public. People are generally well-versed in. And so these were just some of our models and our studies. These are some of the this modeling program called Genesis, which is a very high-level program that allowed us to study many different breakwater configurations and understand the shoreline response. So a big piece of the adaptive design process is kind of working in this world of modeling, coastal modeling. Also trying to understand the actual benefits it would bring the community in terms of this project still lets the water in, right? It's not cutting off the community from the water, but it's still water flooding instead of high energy, extreme wave action and devastating velocity along the shoreline. So that's what this modeling is beginning to look at. The project also advanced from a material complexity standpoint, thinking about the actual stone sizes, trying to create that juvenile finfish hidey holes, but also trying to use these alternative materials like the large stone, the smaller stone, and ecological concrete tide pools and armor units that have different textures and habitat capacities built into them. And then physical modeling, out in this is a landscape architect's dream, to have your project built in a wave tank, an actual wave tank used for coastal engineers. And so this was done in Canada. This is a version of the breakwaters that was built by the modeling team in Canada, and every piece of stone is scaled down, not only in size, but also in weight. And the waves that are run through the tank are scaled to the environment of Staten Island. And so different storm simulations were run on this model. They're these really crazy day glow colors because each color of stone represents a different size of stone. And so if you run the waves on the model and then you come back and you have a jelly bean mix of stones, from an engineering perspective, that's really bad, right? That means that your breakwater is falling apart. And so, because this is a breakwater that needs to stay structurally intact. So it's, if a blue stone is out of place, you're able to recognize it and kind of refine the design. So you can see the reef streets and the reef fingers were also modeled within this work. This is someone kind of rearranging the concrete units, which were a very high density concrete in the model. And then this is the project today. I love these two images together because this is the hand working in the modeling tank, and this is the custom constructed crane on a barge that Weeks Marine designed for this project to help offload and unload the material for the breakwaters. So this is one of these living breakwaters with the reef streets emerging from it on the right, and some of the cranes and the pontoon excavators shaping and that material and equipment. The competition image from many years ago and updated with the new alignment is on the left, and the breakwater system kind of unfolding into the distance. This is high tide, so you can't see the reef streets, is on the right. So it's a 2,400 linear foot project, so it's very large scale for a landscape project of this type. And it's still under construction, so it's still a very new project that has, once it's completed, will be monitored for many years, both for its physical risk reduction abilities, but also for its habitat generation potential. And even today in the construction process, it's become It's really interesting to see how like the ecosystems and species are beginning to use the space. It's become a favorite haul-out area for, we've affectionately named this Steel Stanley on the top left here, who's begun to use one of the breakwaters as a place to haul out. But it's also being used like by seagulls to drop clams and kind of engaging with the underwater and above water ecosystems in different ways. And then our partners at the Harbor School are advancing the oyster restoration layer, which will come after the breakwater construction is fully complete. And they're kind of stockpiling and harvesting shell from local New York City restaurants, curing it in Staten Island in this like giant shell pile so they don't introduce any new pathogens into the underwater environment, and bringing it to the breakwaters once everything is kind of in its place. But I think one thing that's really interesting about this work is that it's not only kind of about getting the finished product going, both ecologically and physically. It's also about monitoring it and studying it over time. So, you know, this is such a large investment. It's a big project in Staten Island. How can we use it as an ecological experiment? So I would urge all of you to think about, can you embed ecological experiments into all of your work? So here, we're testing different layouts of the e-concrete units, the tide pools, the reefs. Some of them are designed to attract oysters, some are designed to host juvenile finfish, like I mentioned. So we have different configurations, and the whole system is like designed to be like a statistically viable experiment that can be monitored with a control, so over time to see how these reef streets either do or do not generate the habitat that we had in our minds when we were doing the design process. So there'll be more to come on this effort. And so this is just a snapshot of breakwater construction. A lot of the reef streets are still under construction for the later breakwaters, but I hope, you know, to return in a couple of years and kind of share updates and projects here. I also just wanted to maybe kind of end with a quick series of projects that talks about how this work, both with SCAPE and the kind of wild world of coastal engineering, and with the Dredge Research Collaborative, can like really be applied and scaled in like many kinds of projects, right? Like I almost wish all of our projects were like coastal underwater cool breakwaters at SCAPE, but like they're not. I also love working on parks and plazas and other forms of other space. So this work really does inform that and scale in different ways. So I'll just quickly mention our work at China Basin Park. This is a 5-acre park on the San Francisco waterfront. I showed it earlier in the presentation. You know, it has many elements of like well-composed collective waterfront gathering spaces, like a great lawn and a central plaza and a lifted grove for gathering and shade, as well as an urban promenade activated by new areas of the Mission Rock development. You know, one of the things we really had to think about in this project was like coastal resilience, sea level rise, and increased storm events in San Francisco. The Bay Trail runs through this project and became like this almost like line of protection where we were elevating the Bay Trail to help protect the development and the neighborhoods behind from sea level rise. So this is that like aerial view of the kind of design vision with the new neighborhood unfolding behind. Our clients in this project are both the San Francisco Giants, because the Giant Stadium is right across the way and they own and operate this property, as well as Tishman Speyer, kind of developing a new like multifamily residential and mixed-use complex in Mission Rock. But it needed to be thought about as a resilient public space. And I think one of the most important lessons, this is the project under construction that will be open on Friday. So again, would love to invite you there and see you there on the opening. One of the most important lessons here is a really basic lesson. I think that so much of the dialogue around adapting for climate change and protecting and reducing risk to like critical assets like new buildings or infrastructure is about elevation. It's about building up, right? It's like, how do we get higher? What elevation do we hit? How do we build up these edges? How do we keep the water out? And in many cases in these highly urban environments, you do need to do that and think about that. That's really important for the longevity of this new waterfront neighborhood. And so this whole green area in this project is a really like carefully composed series of topographic highlands and planted grove terraces that do build up to these new future elevations and create this zone of protection. But resilience is also about stepping down, right? It's about stepping down, getting closer to the water. We have two big moments of stepping down in this project. One is on the left, it's a stormwater garden, so it's kind of behind the line of protection, but it's an absorptive space that receives stormwater from the entire development. of the phase 1. And then the other space is this kind of beach, more like open, kind of beach-like inspired perched beach ecosystem, which has like a baseball statue and a whole legacy. If you're a baseball buff, we're gonna call this McCovey Beach because it kind of features the statue of William McCovey facing the Giant Stadium. But it's also this moment to kind of step down, acknowledge that landscapes can be flooded, they can be more dynamic. Even in our highly urban areas, you can have more of these resilient landscapes that both build up and step down. That's a really like basic, simple lesson, but it's an important lesson that we try and apply in all of our waterfront projects that might span a tiny little block or a 5 or 30 acre park. We're also trying to scale these ideas to the neighborhood scale. So SCAPE has been involved in a number of kind of projects in the Gowanus Canal area of Brooklyn. This is a highly contaminated, it's a Superfund site. It's undergoing like a big dredging and remediation. It's also just undergone a giant rezoning effort where new large residential buildings are being built in this neighborhood and new public access paths are being added. We worked with a nonprofit group called the Gowanus Canal Conservancy to come up with this new landscape plan that we called the Gowanus Lowlands. That was really a vision for how all of these dramatic changes facing this neighborhood of giant rezoning, climate change issues, and contaminated Superfund project could really be leveraged in a positive way to set like a positive template for what should happen in the future. And so, you know, there's always these kind of really interesting overlays between like the historic ecosystem and the risks associated with that and today's ecosystem, urban ecosystem and the risk associated with that. But one of the kind of key elements of this project was thinking about how to advise private landowners, because most of the canal is privately owned, the edges of it are privately owned and all being developed by real estate developers into housing complexes. How do we think about these edges as like, these edges are bulkheads, they're hard, these are not like the most like robust or adaptive like design elements. They also have to remain bulkheads because it's part of the Superfund cleanup where they need to separate the newly cleaned canal from contaminated like adjacent sites and other sources of contamination. They also needed to be bulkheaded just so the Army Corps could, or the Superfund entity could be doing like the literal like dredging and remediation of the canal itself. And so we worked with the Gowanus Canal Conservancy to think about more innovative ways that still could have like ecological overlays at the bulkhead scale. So how they could begin to advise landowners on how to have hardened bulkhead edges that met all of the restrictions of the different agencies, but allowed access for people and allowed different potential ecosystems to emerge over time. So that could be something as simple as like just a lower bulkhead that had wild planting that would spill over the edge, or an actual tidal ecosystem kind of built into the strip along the edge, or an accessible like step down and kind of way of people connecting with the newly cleaned water of the Gowanus. So these were like fun images to like make and create, but really the important kind of work in this project and a lot of like the coastal dynamic landscape thinking came with a collaboration with Langen Engineering to develop this document, which looks a little boring, but it's really very exciting, called the Bulkhead Decision-Making Matrix, right? So landowners could begin to think about how these individual decisions of like setting the elevation of a new bulkhead on their site could actually impact both the public space and the ecosystem of the future. So this was a really important tool, not just for like one specific site, but like all across the canal, because probably 30 or 40 different landowners were like in the process of making this individual decision on totally different timeframes about their site. So the work of the Lowlands Plan helped really like pull all of this together and again like choreographed between the different groups. And you know, some really positive recent outcomes. SCAPE is working on many projects here, but these two have interesting edges. In one of our projects that we just opened at Huntington Street along the Gowanus, we weren't able to do a fully tidal shelf, but we're calling it a future tidal shelf because with sea level rise, this will become a tidal ecosystem in the future. So the raised elevated public promenade is out of the zone of future flooding, where the bulkhead is lower and has a tidal shelf has a planted shelf that can become tidal. And then in some of our public projects, we've actually been able to take chunks out of the bulkhead and dramatically lower them and create larger spaces for tidal wetlands. And a lot of this is like due to that kind of pre-positioning and planning that the Gowanus Canal Conservancy was able to advance because of this like comprehensive thinking about the canal. And then finally, like, we're also trying to scale this thinking up to the regional scale. So I mentioned SCAPE is working in coastal Louisiana. We recently collaborated on the 2023 Coastal Master Plan, which helps. It's a 50-year plan for $50 billion in risk reduction and restoration projects. A lot of it funded through the BP oil spill and recovery money. The kind of planning for how this money flows and how it restores the subsiding coastal Louisiana landscape, which, by the way, has subsided because sediment flows upstream through dams and channels have like cut off coastal Louisiana from its life-giving sediment supply. There's a theme here tonight. But they have to do this coastal master plan every 6 years, and SCAPE played a really small, but I think transformative role in the recent update of the master plan, being a visual communicator on the project, and that's been really important to the work. I think because so much of this work is very abstract and very difficult to understand. You know, many of like the technical drawings in previous plans were more like the engineering diagrams in the top right, and so we played a big role in helping translate a lot of the amazing science that was going into this really comprehensive planning document in a way that people could understand and engage. And so, you know, this is the example of like just one of the many strategies that the state is advancing around barrier island maintenance and restoration to help protect inland communities and help restore offshore ecosystems. We're trying to like visualize both how this landscape kind of changes from present day. So the lower line is showing some of the elevations of the existing landscape, how we've been building up on top of that with some of these different restoration projects, but also the process behind it, kind of suggesting like where some of the sediment movement and materials for this work is actually coming from. And then one of, I think, really important things that we did with this project was for many years the Coastal Master Plan has represented land loss as red, right? Which in the beginning of the master planning process was really important to kind of open people's eyes to like the impact and what's potentially being lost at the scale of the state, right? At all these red zones with climate change, with low sediment supply, are potentially at risk of becoming underwater landscape. But in this most recent plan, we really tried to work with the entire organization of the CPRA to think about, you know, the theme of this conference is sunny side up, right? It's trying to take this like more optimistic, more action-oriented perspective on what we all can do. We don't all need to sit around and like fret about the red map. What we should be doing is thinking about how we can transform that red map, but also how we can live with new watery landscapes. And so this is just a simple color shift. Instead of showing land loss as red, we're showing it as land change in blue and green, and talking about the new kinds of ecosystems that will emerge. These landscapes will not disappear, they will transform, but also how active restoration and sediment design projects can help play a role in sustaining the landscapes that we have today. So that are like students and youth in design involved in a lot of these like very important coastal issues that shape our everyday life. That's what the book is about. We've also been collaborating with entities like the Army Corps of Engineers, trying to create these little workshops where landscape architects doing some of this work are coming and sharing with engineers who are also doing some of this engineering with nature work. This has been like some very successful collaborations, again at a very small scale. It takes a lot of time to make like institutional, generational change, but I just wanted to highlight some of the work that's happening with the DRC and Auburn University and the Engineering with Nature program, and put up the web link for that work. And I also just wanted to end with like a shout out to some of my Dres Research Collaborative friends and partners here. Like SCAPE is applying this work in so many of our projects and ideas. Sean and Brian are applying it in a new practice they have formed along with other great collaborators, like doing sediment design projects. Brett here tonight is doing his work across the Bay Delta, work like thinking about adaptive management of sediment influenced landscapes, like at Frank's Track Futures. And so personally, I'm just very inspired by this work and wanted to put it out there as like, take a photo with your phone and like look up these firms and these projects in your future, because there's many inspiring people kind of cross-pollinating that ideas and all coming together to think about like larger ecological and social change. So thank you so much for your time and patience this evening, and I put our little handles up here and happy to answer any questions.